In terms of the landscape the way it is now, though, is there like is there been time for like regulation to be put in place? Is that becoming like is that more mainstream now, or is that still are they still catching up with the regulations as well? Is that something that needs to be really worked on so when they know the true potential of what really
Yeah.
can happen, like what regulation is there? Is it profound at the moment, or is it still being configured?
Still being configured. I would say we're seeing early signs of regulatory impact on the API security space. And, same thing we saw with cloud computing. For a long time, the auditors, they had no idea what to make of any of this stuff. And little by little, PCI and HIPAA and so on, they started to create sets of controls for cloud environments. Current state, I've not seen anything specific to API security in HIPAA, PCI, NIST cybersecurity framework is lacking it. NIST 853, another common financial services one, is lacking it. The impact that we've seen so far on the regulatory side, it's kind of funny because it's a little bit hit or miss, and it's on SOC 2. And, if for people who aren't familiar with SOC 2, SOC 2 is more about your operations and kind of, let's say, consistency of operation, good security practices, but not super prescriptive. But one part of SOC 2 is a penetration test and some ongoing penetration testing of, let's say, external applications that your company owns or services that you run and so on. And so it's a little bit down to how good your pen testers are right now as to whether they actually pull APIs in scope or not. We've seen some, yes, but I'd say that's, kind of 1 in 10 maybe at this point who have started to recognize that there is like a real attack surface, there is real risk of data exposure and so on relative to APIs. So very early days of this, I would say.
Right. And that's another scary fact in this that the regulation isn't catching up yet, but I'm assuming it will do. And with
It
like companies
will.
like yourselves, like oh, bringing bringing this more like out of the shadows and into like the real like the mainstream, whether it be enterprise or whether it be main like the middle level companies. I think that can only be a good thing that we get more and more visibility over this and understanding from it. Um, I mean, I think we could talk all day about this. I really do. It seems like there is so much really that we could open up, and every piece we talk about, we could open up further and further and further. Um, in terms of like as a almost like a conclusion to this, where like I suppose I mean it's the question that everybody asks, but like where is this going? What do you think what do the next 2 or 3 years like are going to bring to us from like an API and or almost I suppose it's a full cybersecurity way, but where do you find like the cloud? Where are we going to go now for the next maybe 2 or 3 years? What do you think is
Yeah.
going to be the future?
Look, I think I came to this from cloud security. And I
Mhm.
came to this from kind of the evolution of watching how customers used cloud over time. And what we saw was kind of, and I'm rewinding, I know, taking a tangent, but I promise we'll get there. What we saw in like the early days was people operated cloud environments very much like they operate data centers. And then they start their cloud kind of, let's call it the cloud maturity journey. And they start to get a little bit better and they realize, oh, there's a lot of value if I get out of the business of managing my database servers and so on. And so they move things to RDS or other kind of database as a service offerings. And then, they get one level wiser again and they realize, wow, actually, like there's a lot of power in this kind of ephemeral compute architecture. And, we can like do upgrades faster. We can cycle from version 1 to version 2 so much quicker. And if there's problems, we can roll back with infrastructure as code. And they embrace all those things that we hear talked about and, those buzzwords that do end up actually being useful once you've understood them properly and can kind of implement a process around them. And then what we see at the end of that is, they get to a point where they're like, actually, virtual machines are kind of terrible. They're really just the equivalent of servers, but I still have to manage them like servers. I've got to install agents and patch them and blah, 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 blah. And actually, there's no benefit from that. Really, I just want like a compute infrastructure to run my application. And so they kind of get to that point and then they realize containers are better. They realize serverless is better for other use cases. And once they go through that transformation, they end up with very much a decomposed microservice architecture. And the common thread is APIs sitting on a network. And those APIs are kind of fronting data sets, and they're also enabling business transactions. So that was kind of the evolution I saw on the cloud side. The reason I take the time of kind of making that point is because what I see on that side actually kind of mirrors where cloud security tooling has gone. So cloud security tooling really started from that infrastructure, those early open S3 bucket use cases. And then it kind of added more visibility into to identities and IAM, identity and access management on AWS and Azure and Google and all the cloud providers. And then it started to kind of move up the stack, right? So you started to get visibility into container clusters. You started to get visibility into operating systems. And then you would see correlations between like, this EC2 instance sitting on this VPC with these ports open to the world. Well, that instance has CVE ABC123. And so we've got a real risk around that instance connected to this RDS server with this data set on it. And you start to see these levels of correlation that are pretty new to cloud security, honestly. It's really been about the last kind of 2.5, 3-ish years that started to be a thing. And that is a much more powerful view, by the way. Because if we think about like that initial assessment where I've just got so much inventory and then I get a checklist of things that are wrongly configured, well, that's a lot of work and it's also hard to contextualize. But when I have that kind of full contextual view of, this instance, this vulnerability connected to this data set because of these open ports, et cetera, like now I can really understand risk. And what I think is going to happen is that, it continues to kind of come together. And I think APIs become the layer on top of that because they are the outwardly exposed thing. And so you're going to see APIs on top of that stack. This API with this poor authentication protocol connects to this workload that has this data set. And you'll again have, a better contextualized risk quantification model that you can use to improve your overall security for the organization. I do think we're in the early days of that, by the way. Like, I think we're kind of, I don't know, 1.5 years, 2-ish years away from that all kind of coming together in one consumable stack. But that's where I think it's going to turn. And I do think, we saw at RSA, for instance, a number of people that I saw talking about kind of the combination of cloud security and application security, bringing those two constructs together. You see a lot of this kind of consolidation because I think that context is so critical. We've all got more security problems in our organizations than we care to admit. And, when you can contextualize them, you can kind of make an assessment as to what's really super high risk that needs to be taken care of like ASAP and what's like, okay, one step below that and let me go put out the burning fires first. That's what I see, really.
Well, I think that seems it does seem logical that we start to compact, we start to build, like you said, like add in extra layers onto the stack to give that more context into the like the data. I mean, obviously, clearly, we're so data abundant, and it's just becoming as we become more and more savvy with what's there. I think obviously it's going to go that way as you say. But like I said, we could talk about this. I'm sure we could talk about this all day. But
Yeah.
it's been an absolute pleasure to have had you on, Jeremy, and we really do appreciate your time and your expertise. And I'm sure our audience will too. So no, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure, Kieran.